I was sitting in my tiny little house in Lane Cove on my kitchen table with my home phone. And I think I'd even got a mobile phone at that point in time. I was answering my home phone as Google Australia for probably 2 to 3 weeks, actually, and spent a lot of time interviewing potential candidates over the phone.
Kate Vale is the definition of a tech pioneer. She was employee number 1 for Google Australia after flying across the world to their Mountain View headquarters for hours of gruelling interviews to secure the job. She was there when YouTube thought $2 billion was a good price tag from Google, even though that sum now seems like a total steal. And she was one of the top minds at music streaming platform Spotify when Australia was considered their test market. Kate's now helping the next generation of digital pioneers get their start. With her business partner, Marissa Warren, Kate started the venture capital fund Aliavia, which is focused on supporting female-founded startups. Let me take you back to the 90s. You were listening to Celine Dion or Pearl Jam, watching Good Will Hunting and Titanic, and becoming familiar with this sound. The sound of internet dial-up. And as the information superhighway took off, so did the .com era. Kate Vale was right there during this pivotal moment in the late 1990s when the .com companies were booming. Welcome to Curveball, Kate.
Thank you. Very excited to be here, Kelly.
You started your career working in HR in a law firm. So I'm interested in how you made your journey from there to working for an internet company instead when it was the Wild West at the time, the internet.
When I was at university, I went to Monash University in Melbourne. My aunt was head of HR at a law firm in Melbourne. And I did a little bit of work experience with her and thought that was kind of what I wanted to do. That was where I was going to head my career. So when I finished my degree, I managed to land a job in a pretty decent sized law firm, actually. Back then it was called Purvis Clark Richards and it turned into Gaydon's Lawyers, which I think is pretty well known in Australia. And I think I was there for a couple of years and I worked my way up and was eventually HR manager before I left. But started realising that working in a law firm with 30 partners, 29 of them men, and I was kind of working for them and was seen as an overhead cost, that it wasn't really for me. I don't regret it because I learned so much about the people component there and how to hire people and how to interview people and how to build a culture, and that's so important. But it was actually the managing director of the law firm, a guy called Bradley Brown, and I'm still in contact with him these days, sat me down in his office one day and he said, "You know what, Kate," in his American accent, "I honestly don't think this is for you." And I said, I actually agree with you. And he said, "I think you'd be great in sales. You've just got that great personality and you're very persuasive." And it was back in 98, just as the .com was starting to happen. In fact, when I was in HR, my way of internal communication around the office was the internal memo on your desk. So I had to wait for the mail boy to come around every couple of hours to distribute my mail so that I could communicate with the few hundred people in the company, in the firm that I was working at. And just as I was leaving that role, someone put a computer on my desk. And it kind of fascinated me. And we had an IT team. They just started up an IT team in the firm. So I learned all that I could about getting onto email, and there was this new thing called the internet just taking off. And I thought that's where I wanted to be. And it just so happened that a company called TMP Worldwide in Melbourne, which were in newspaper advertising, had just acquired globally a company called Monster.com, famously competing with Seek back then, who are obviously now the only way to find your job in Australia. And so I went along for the job interview, and they liked the fact that I had an HR background and that I would be selling to HR professionals. So I took on the role, and I actually really liked it, and I loved that sales component of it. And I was in the Melbourne office for about a year and doing pretty well and getting some good numbers and some good commission checks. And then they offered me a national role in Sydney. So I packed up my car, and in the end of 98, I drove with all my belongings and my dog to Sydney to start fresh.
So it was an exciting time. You're at monster.com, the internet's starting to explode. People are getting, dial up at home. I can remember doing my first assignment and using the internet to source material, and it was so exciting. But of course, it became quite volatile in the digital industry not long later. What sort of signs did you see of the looming .com crash?
After monster.com, I went and worked for Aussiemail, which is an Australian ISP, and probably one of the biggest ISPs back then behind Telstra. And I was sitting in their media sales department from about 99 to 2000. And because I was in media sales, I was talking a lot to brands and agencies out in the market about how the web could benefit them and their brand. And I all of a sudden started seeing from these huge budgets to pretty much dwindling budgets, and we were wondering what on earth was going on. And then we started sort of seeing what was going on globally, and there were stocks crashing and these really big internet companies around the world that had all these huge valuations early on, all of a sudden just worth $1 billion and then the next minute worth $100,000. I went through a phase of that boom where you'd pretty much call a client or call a bank and tell them about a new advertising property on your website, and they'd just sign a check. And they didn't really care so much about how that campaign was going to perform. It was more about that they were seen to be the first to be doing some of these ad campaigns, and they wanted to be in the press about them. They wanted people to look at them and think that they were wonderful. And so when I started seeing that these budgets were being pulled back, there was a trend that I saw, and the trend was these brands pushing money to search engine marketing because they could buy keywords in a search engine that were relative to their business and only pay when someone clicked on their advertisement, which was very different to how media agencies and brands were spending online before, when it was all just a cost per thousand. So they paid every time someone saw their ad, but all of a sudden they're paying for someone when someone clicked on their ad. So you can imagine it's a huge difference for a brand. So there was a company in Australia called LookSmart, a search engine that were built in Melbourne in the very early days. And they were hiring, and because I could see budget shifting to search, I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to take up a role there. When I could see jobs being cut all around me, literally at all of the ISPs, at all of the online publishers, jobs were going and roles being made redundant. And LookSmart was in a phase of heavy growth.
This is interesting though, because it was search engines that came through the .com crash relatively unscathed. I'm wondering what kind of search engines were around in Australia at the time other than LookSmart. Were they an early pioneer in the space?
Aussiemail had its own search engine called Answers, but quite small and not very effective. Alta Vista was around. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Yeah. I think Yahoo maybe was around also at that time, but again, I mean, a very, very basic product and nothing like what we were seeing come out of the US.
It is incredible to look back now and think there were all these providers at one point, and then now it's pretty much just Google in a lot of ways. You started to move in your career then into more leadership roles, and you did find yourself on a plane to the US to interview for Google. And Google didn't have an office in Australia at this time. So what made you jump on a plane to the other side of the world to interview for Google?
Yeah, so it was back in the day, 2002, and when we had the desk phones. So we had cell phones, but we weren't using them so much. And I had a call on my desk phone from a guy called David Lee, who was head of international growth at Google. And he said, I've heard your name come up quite a bit and we're opening up our Australian offices, and would you be prepared to jump on a plane in 2 days? And I was like, wow, my gosh. Well, firstly, lucky I have a passport. I've never been to the US before, but sure, let's do it. And the reason I did is because being involved in the search engine world, I knew how good Google were, and myself and my team actually used Google more than we used our own product. So I shouldn't be saying that, but we did. So it was pretty much a no-brainer to get on that plane and to head over to Mountain View.
And describe what Google HQ was like back in those days, sort of early 2000s. Was it intimidating walking into their site at Mountain View? Can you describe it for me?
Not intimidating at all, because there was less than 500 employees. There's probably 100 of those around in other offices. So there may have been 350 to 400 employees over in Mountain View. It was in one building. I think it was like a 3-story building. And everyone was incredibly welcoming, and it was just like a small sort of family operated business. That's how it felt like to me back then.
Now, I'm really interested in what happened next, because Google and other tech companies sort of run these notoriously crazy recruitment processes where there are multiple interviews and lots of crazy questions. Can you talk us through what it was like for you? Like, what unfolded over the next 48 hours as you walked through this interview process with Google?
I arrived early in the morning and left 10 hours later. I spent an entire day there. I had 10 interviews, each of them an hour long, and I was asked a lot of the same questions, which we all know is a faux pas when you do group interview questions. But, I mean, they were very keen on understanding whether I was the right person to ensure that Google culture was embedded in another country around the world. And they knew my experience obviously was great for the role, and they knew that I could do the job, but was I the right person? And I think that Google really focused on that cultural fit with every employee. And I saw that right throughout my time at Google, that was so important. I think also being the first employee in a region was even more so important. And I did, over the years that I was there, spend so much time in Mountain View, ensuring that what we were doing in our remote office was a direct reflection of what was going on in Mountain View.
So tell me about your first day at Google Australia. You were the first and only employee when you started. So were you sitting behind some big desk in an empty office?
No, gosh, no. I was sitting in my tiny little house in Lane Cove on my kitchen table with my home phone. And I think I'd even got a mobile phone at that point in time. I was answering my home phone as Google Australia for probably 2 to 3 weeks, actually, and spent a lot of time interviewing potential candidates over the phone, and then organising to meet people for coffee so I could meet them face to face. So, I mean, growing and scaling an office is all about getting the right people on board. So my focus for the first year was really on hiring people and hiring the right people.
I think you were able to personally approve every new hire for your whole decade there. What do you look for when you're recruiting? What makes a candidate stand out to you?
So I think there's 2 parts here. Firstly, Google we were very stringent. We had really tight guidelines that we had to work within. So that proved to be quite difficult, actually, at times when you're hiring for a specific role, and time consuming, because you really have to find someone that fits within the Google guidelines.
And were there times where you had great candidates in front of you that you weren't able to hire because of this strict sort of cultural fit that you had to have at Google? Like, were there people that you thought, oh, gee, you're great, but not for this?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually a good example of that is my husband. So he worked with me at Google, and he wasn't my husband when I hired him. But I really liked his passion and enthusiasm, and I liked his background and his skill set, but his education wasn't quite right. So it was a long process actually to get him on board, and we did manage to get him through the cracks. But that didn't happen very often. So it was a really rigid process where so many people had to interview. You had to give a certain grade, and they had to have an average grade of above X. Then they went to a recruitment committee internally, so regionally, and then they would go over to Mountain View to sit through the whole process over there as well. So there was a hiring committee meeting once a week, and Larry looked through every single person that was made an offer.
So this is Larry Page, for people wondering who Larry is.
Yes.
The head of Google.
Yes, he had to have the final tick of approval on everyone that came through.
So, I mean, that gets hard as you scale into the thousands, but I'm interested there in what you said about having to let people go. How did you navigate that where, someone with the best intentions gets through several rounds with you, goes to Mountain View, gets through several rounds, gets the tick from Larry. A year into the job, you realise they're just not the right fit. How do you navigate that?
If someone's not working out in their role, there's generally a reason, and the reason is generally that they're not a right fit for the job. And quite often most of the time, if I have an open, transparent, frank conversation with a team member, they're the first to admit that they're probably not the right fit for the role. And maybe that's something that I learned early on when Bradley at the law firm had a frank and honest discussion with me that maybe I wasn't right for the role, and I completely agreed with him. That it's important to move on, and it's a waste of everyone's time if someone's in a role and they're not performing, and there's someone out there's someone that could be doing a much better job.
I do need to ask what happened with your husband. Did he leave Google eventually?
Yeah, he ended up leaving before me, but we had to come clean when we started seeing each other. And that wasn't a great process, but we had to because we were a public company and he was reporting into me. So, gosh, I can't believe how honest and frank I'm being here. But yes, so he had to move into a different part of the business, which was actually great for him because it was another opportunity for him. And he really thrived in the business development team reporting into someone else.
The reason I ask is not to be, super pervy or salacious about it, but in the height of this whole Me Too thing, relationships in the workplace now have an additional layer, right? And I ended up marrying a man that I met at the ABC. I mean, it's, doctors marry nurses. But of course you had the power balance there. So I know it's some time ago, but how did Google help you navigate that?
Yeah, we were not the first Google employees to get together. We at that point in time, we were a big global company and there were a lot of Google employees getting together. There was just a set of protocols around it. And when we knew that we were going to be a couple, and probably for a long time, then we had to come clean. But there had to be tight guidelines around it, particularly as a public company.
Kate Vale was Google Australia's first employee. She eventually also builds both YouTube and Spotify's Play in Australia before relocating to the United States. But there's a few bumps to come in Kate's career. Kate Vale owns the venture capital firm Aliavia with her business partner Marissa Warren. She was the managing director of Google and YouTube in Australia, where she grew the business from nothing at her kitchen table to a $500 million turnover. She also launched Spotify in Australia and led both businesses to IPO. Kate, you found your feet as a leader with Google, and along came the public nature of the role, speaking to the media, leading bigger teams, setting out that vision. How comfortable were you to be the public face of Google Australia?
Oh my gosh, I just got goosebumps thinking about that. I was so scared. But the one thing that Google did very well was making you comfortable and hiring people to really nurture and develop you. So when Google was having all of its official launch in the marketplace, a lady called Debbie Frost, who actually ended up at Facebook, came out to Australia and really helped me work through that. So gave me full media training, sat down with me, did practice interviews with me. I had to do TV, which was incredibly nerve-wracking. I'd never done any of that kind of thing before. And as much as I was nervous and anxious and didn't want to do it, looking back, I'm so glad I did it. It was so good for my self-confidence, but also really teaching me the rights and wrongs around how to speak publicly and how to appear on live TV, live radio.
You were also employee number 1 in Australia. You were the leader. So what were the challenges around being a female leader at that time for you?
I'm not sure if there are any challenges around being a female leader until it came time to having children.
This is an issue, of course, that many women face. Right when your career is absolutely firing on all cylinders is usually the time you decide to have a family. How did you manage that?
Probably not as well as I could have. I decided, which a lot of women do, and I saw this happening a lot at Google in Mountain View, that I just shouldn't have a long time off. I should shorten my maternity leave. So instead of taking the standard 12 months off, I took 6 months out because I was so anxious about the company growing around me and growing without me. I thought that I was kind of like integral to the growth of that company, and I'd hired every single person, and I didn't want to lose out. I didn't want to lose out on my role. I didn't want to lose out on hiring new people. I didn't want to lose out on moving into new premises and being the first in there. And there were so many things that I was anxious about that I just took a short maternity leave, which I regret. I didn't do it again.
And how did you manage that stepping away psychologically when you were so instrumental in setting up the culture?
Not well until I gave birth. And then I'm such a maternal person and I love my children so much that the love for my child just took over, and that was my number 1 priority. And from that day onwards actually has been my number 1 priority. And it's strange as a woman when business is your number 1 priority and your job is your number 1 priority, and then all of a sudden it's not. It's your family. And your family comes first. And in every decision you make, your family comes before everything else.
So you have 6 months off. What was it like that first day, both leaving your child and then re-entering the workplace?
Highly emotional. I certainly didn't want to be leaving my child. And I think, I was still breastfeeding at that point in time. So that was a challenge in itself. But I was still dead keen to get back into the workforce. I know a bunch of women that have to leave their child at home for the first time. We all feel the same. It's an intense moment, and I'll never forget that day actually walking out and leaving him for the first time after being with him every single day for 6 months. It's not easy, but I was still so keen to get back into the office and really get my teeth into what was going on. But going back was strange. New faces walking around the office. We had grown a lot in that 6-month time frame. Google had acquired YouTube not long before that, and we were setting up the YouTube offices in Australia and New Zealand. So that was actually a really great challenge for me because I was taking over a part of the business that I hadn't really been involved in before. And it was also the very early days of when YouTube was still working out its monetization model. Back then, they thought $2 billion was a lot of money to acquire that little video search engine, and it certainly turned out to be a very good decision.
So you weren't back in the office for too long when another curveball arose. How did you find out you were pregnant again, and how quickly did that happen?
it wasn't supposed to happen because I was weaning and I didn't take necessary precautions. So, I mean, I shouldn't have really been surprised. But yeah, I was 3 months into the role and found out I was pregnant and had to break it to them that I was pregnant again. It was just an honest, frank discussion, and I definitely knew this time that when I went out on maternity leave that I wasn't going to make it a rushed maternity leave, and I went out for 12 months and stood by that.
So not long after returning after your second child, you decide to head off to the music streaming platform Spotify, and you're really starting out again there, bringing another big tech company to Australia. How was your confidence going into that role?
I mean, it was interesting because it was still a managing director role, running a country of a global business, but it was in the music industry. And I didn't know a lot about music. I loved, and I do love still music, but that was kind of a new thing for me to learn. But it was also, Spotify was in its infancy. It was only a few years old. There was only 200 employees around the world. And it was a very, very new way of consuming music. And Australians hadn't really cottoned onto it yet. So the only reason I could tell it was going to be successful is because I had to play with it beforehand, and I got my account, and I'm such a big music lover that I loved what the product was. And I thought, if this can change the way I consume music, I think it can change the way many Australians consume music. So my biggest challenge was trying to teach Australians that they could consume music in a new way, and it might look illegal, but it wasn't.
And of course, Australia was a great market for Spotify to be testing new products because there wasn't true market penetration of Spotify, as you mentioned. So how did you run that sort of R&D culture within Spotify Australia?
Yeah, I mean, it was something that my team and I pushed a lot globally, is it really use Australia as a testing ground for new products. And they did a lot, because Australia was, I think, the 7th largest music market in the world. We had a huge catalogue in Australia. We were working with all of the labels, the major labels. And because we were big, but we were small, so small that if things were tried and new products were implemented and it didn't work, there wouldn't be a huge impact like it would if they were testing it in Sweden or the US or in other European markets where Spotify was already quite significant.
And that's interesting to me, because there's a lot of companies, as they transition from a high growth startup culture to a fully fledged established company that's trucking along. Does that pressure change? Because a startup can be quite forgiving. They want you to try things. They want you to fail at things. But there comes a point where that's no longer the culture they want. So how do you switch that with your staff?
To be honest, I think both of those companies still have that philosophy. Try new things, fail fast, and try again. I think the only thing that really changes as you grow over time is when a company IPOs and becomes a public company, and you're responsible to shareholders. And then a whole bunch of processes and procedures have to pop up, and you have to abide by, and you have to make sure your team abide by. And I went through IPO with both Google and Spotify, so I can say that it is a real challenge and a bunch of training that needs to be done with your team to ensure that they're falling into place with regulations. And it's so important when you're public. And, even coming up to IPO, and we couldn't talk to the press. You can't talk to the press. I think it's like 6 months before you IPO, and you're in your quiet period. And interestingly enough, like, a lot of journalists really took to that quite badly. But I mean, there's nothing legally you can do. And I think when you're in startup phase, you tend to be quite messy with the way you do things. And then once you go past IPO, you just don't have that opportunity to be messy. You have to really follow the rules and follow everything that needs to be done in a public company.
Kate, you've started from the ground up so many times now, including moving to the US in the last few years where you live now. Has it been difficult to establish yourself in that much bigger pond in California?
Look, I mean, it's always a challenge when you begin your career in a country and you become, you establish a reputation as a professional in a certain country, and then you move. I mean, Australia, when you look at America, Australia is really small. It's like a tenth of the size of the US. I did find it challenging. I was no longer a big fish in a small pond. I was a small fish in a big pond. And I definitely felt that in the first few years, but managed to get around it.
You've also started an early stage venture capital firm. What took you down that path?
So Marissa Warren, my co-founder, and I met in 2019, and we were introduced by a mutual friend. Marissa had just moved over, and my mutual friend said, "You two should catch up." When a mutual friend you really love and respect tells you should catch up with someone that they love and respect, you always say yes. And we got along, and in early 2020, I called her and I said, "Look, I'm ready to look at some full-time options." And I knew she had a pre-accelerator for female tech founders, a company called Aliavia, which she founded in 2015. And I thought that she may know some interesting people for me to meet. And she said, "Why don't you become part of the Aliavia expert program and mentor some of our female founders?" And so I did that for a little bit, and then we kept chatting. And then she said to me one day, "Do you know what? I think we should start a VC fund for female tech founders. You're really passionate about this area. You've always been a supporter of women in business. I've got this female founder pre-accelerator for female tech founders, and I believe in the same thing. And we've got this shared drive to help female founders. Why don't we do this? Let's put a VC fund together." And I'd never really thought that I would ever become a venture capitalist, but I think it took me less than 5 minutes to say yes. And I think I agreed actually on that phone call. I don't think it even took a follow-up phone call. And the two of us came together pretty quickly and formed Aliavia. And we now have a fund, and we have already raised, and we're doing our first close, and we're investing in some pretty amazing female tech founders across the US and Australia.
Given so few female founders are supported with venture capital or private equity funding, how difficult was it for you and Marissa to get investors who wanted to tip into your fund? How did you get that money flowing at the beginning?
Marissa and I are not very patient people, and it was taking way too long for us. So maybe after month 4 or 5, we started sort of noticing a trend in the feedback of why we couldn't get investors on board. And most of the feedback we got was around the fact that we were first-time fund managers and we didn't have any experience in investing together. Even though we'd both done it, I'd done a number of angel investments, and in fact, a couple of those are on track to become unicorns. So I had success doing it myself, and Marissa had done it with her pre-accelerator. But the fact that we hadn't done deals together was a real turn-off for potential investors. So what we actually got a little bit creative about it, and we went out to friends and family, and we did a raise, and we raised money paying them back interest. And with the money that we raised, which was over $1 million, we had the opportunity to invest in companies and go through the entire process ourselves, including meeting founders, going through the due diligence process, going through all the paperwork, the legals. And we did it. We invested in a few companies, and one of them has actually tripled in value now. And when we got the runs on the board, we could go back to the investors that we'd spoken to that had said no to us at the start, and they were actually interested. So it was a different type of fundraising, but really worked for us. And I'm not sure if we would have got the fund off the ground if we hadn't have gone about it the way we did.
How much are you seeing the landscape change around funding into particularly female-founded companies? Have you seen that change a little bit? I mean, you mentioned there the stats being so demoralising, but can you feel a shift yet?
To be honest, no. I mean, we're still very early days. There's a lot of VC funds in the US that focus on women. Not enough, but there's a lot more than Australia. So there's a real need to have women at the top. Quite often, and we get this feedback from our female founders all the time, is if they're pitching to women, women generally get them and get their ideas. Quite often they're female-centric. And pitching to men is sometimes a waste of time because they don't understand what they're trying to do and what they're trying to sell. And I honestly believe that female founders enjoy pitching to female GPs more than they do men.
Kate, you've been such a pioneer in so many ways, so I hope this venture capital fund that supports female founders really takes off and you change, those statistics. Congratulations. Thanks so much for coming on Curveball.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me. That was fun.
Kate Vale, a former leader for Google, YouTube and Spotify in Australia. She's now living in the United States running Aliavia. It's an early stage venture capital firm. Curveball's produced by Dead Set Studios. Do us a quick favour right now, leave a review for Curveball in whichever podcast app you use. It does help other people interested in leadership and business and entrepreneurship find our show. This episode was produced by Jenna Coda and Liam Reardon. Sound design by Chrissy Miltiadu. The executive producers for Curveball are me and Rachel Fountain. And you can find more at curveballshow.com.
But I still wanted...
That's okay. We'll use that in the outtakes.